We've got a really jam-packed session for you with a lot of really, really great answers to questions that I'm sure that you have been wondering. So like Leah said, please go ahead and put your questions through the Q&A function. Just go ahead and put them down as they pop into your mind, and we'll have some time at the end to answer them. You might also find as we go through that we might answer your questions as they go. That's fine too. Just put them down as they pop into your head. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panelists now. So as Leah mentioned, we're really fortunate to be joined by professionals both from MNP and from MDK Business Law. So Gavin Miranda is a partner of taxation services in MNP's Ottawa office, and he has more than 17 years of experience helping public and private companies with their tax compliance, tax consulting, and tax provisioning needs. He's worked with clients in a number of industries, assisting with business models and domestic and international tax considerations and in-depth tax compliance. And Gavin is a chartered professional accountant and a chartered accountant. Jim Cruikshank is MNP's human capital consulting leader, and he brings over 15 years of consulting experience in organizational design, change management, HR function across a broad range of clients, including middle market, provincial and federal governments, municipalities, and crown corporations. And last but certainly not least, Simon Sigler is a lawyer at MDK Business Law, and his practice is focused on commercial litigation and real estate litigation, though he'll be talking about a lot of employment law topics today. And his legal expertise includes leasing, civil litigation, commercial litigation, and employment litigation. So thanks to our panelists for being with us today on this very snowy day in Ottawa. I'm told Jim doesn't have any snow where he is. Very lucky guy. So we'll go ahead and kick it off. So we had some questions from folks who had registered ahead of time that they gone ahead and put through. And so some of the questions reflect some of those. So first question, what should you do as an employer when an employee requests to work outside of the city, the province, or the country? What do we need to be aware of from a legal and health and safety perspective?
Okay, so I'll take this one to start.
Yeah.
So one of the things that we're going to see come up a lot is people making requests for accommodation. And I think this is a great way to introduce the concept of a duty to accommodate that's going to run through the entire series as we go on today. And essentially, the duty to accommodate provides an employer with a duty to make certain accommodations to the point that it doesn't cause undue hardship on the employer. So when you're talking about somebody that's working, they request to work from home or from a different city, there's going to be a positive duty on that employer to accommodate that request. It's yet to be seen the lengths that those requests will have to go. And what we do advise is that people take it on a case-by-case basis. One of the topics that have come up in terms of moving cities is that, the cost of living changes from city to city. So someone might be used to working in Toronto where their salaries might be higher, and then they suddenly move to Burlington and they're going to be working with a much lower cost of living, they're going to be spending lower costs on their living expenses while making that Toronto salary. And people have wondered whether or not you can reduce their salary there. And that will also go towards whether or not the reduction constitutes a substantial change in their salary. So while it is allowable, you still have to follow the regular procedures relating to a reduction of salary. Generally, we take that to mean around 10 to 15%. But there has been emergency legislation that's been passed that has allowed a decrease up to 20%. That being said, this would not prevent any claim or cause of claim for constructive dismissal. It would then just be up for the employer to rebut that claim and prove that there was not a substantial change in the conditions of the workplace.
Okay, awesome. Jim, I don't know if you had anything you wanted to.
Go ahead. Well, I think, and for those employers that have different offices in different geographies, and it may be a request from an employer, from say Ottawa to go work in Kingston or Cornwall, that you have to consider as that employer that need to protect the health and safety welfare of that employee. But now we're in this situation where the restrictions are different geography to geography, and we really kind of have to have to sort of keep those in mind as to what's allowable, permissible, and what isn't, just because that seems to change by the day these days.
Yeah, I was just going to add that if your employee requests to work in a different province, for example, there's a lot of people in Ottawa that may have family over in Quebec and then decide they need to go there. Or there's a lot of people from out east that have settled in Ottawa that go back and they've become part of the Atlantic bubble. If they're now located there and their salaries are now being paid in that place, you got to think whether or not what their function is, and are they, depending on their function, are they creating a taxable presence in that province for you, and do you then have to allocate your revenue or your profits to that province as well? So other considerations to think of. Usually it's more of a concern with the more executive level people versus some of your junior staff, but just another consideration that you should be aware of from a tax perspective as well.
And Gavin, on the simple employee level too, if somebody was, working from home in Quebec and normally they'd be working in Ottawa, would there be any considerations for diverting source deductions, or would your source deductions change depending on the location of the employee?
Yeah, it could be that their source deductions change, because if their place is now being represented as an office of yours, then that is the office of yours. So they report to the regular workplace, which is now, let's say, in Quebec. So their source deductions could change as well.
Right.
Yeah, really good considerations. I have a feeling we'll get some more questions about this in the Q&A as we go forward. Want to move to some questions now about some of the benefit programs that have come up from the government during COVID. So CERB, the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, and CEWS, which is the wage subsidy program. So we've gotten a lot of questions from our companies about how do these benefits get impacted when you adjust someone's leave or you bring employees back on. People know that there's implications for if you still qualify for those programs, but how do you weigh those considerations?
Yeah, so if there's a lot of maybe I'll start and you guys can add in terms of putting employees on leave and things like that. But from a pure CEWS perspective, and if you're looking to put employees on leave, then it depends if they're on vacation or not, and they're drawing down on a vacation or an overtime bank as to whether or not that counts for remuneration that then can get subsidized under the CEWS program. So that is a consideration to be aware of when you're looking at it. Also, if you've then put people just and furloughed them for a period of time because the business just isn't making money, but you still want to pay them something, then that's a different subset, and you still can get reimbursed for that, but at a lower amount, because you're paying them to basically sit at home. So they're furloughed employees, and therefore there's a reduced amount that they can be eligible for, or you're eligible for, as a subsidy that comes back to you. There was a lot early on. We haven't seen much at this point where people had been put on leave and then were claiming the CERB because they had been taken off. And then the government said, well, you can hire them back and pay them retroactively to then claim it. So, a few of my clients did that because they wanted to help the people out, and the CERB ended up being less than what they would otherwise get. So they did that, and the government subsidized a portion of that, which is great. But the thing to be aware of then is that these employees need to be mindful that they're going to have a tax bill at the end come April, because the CERB payments that they received tax was not withheld from them. So when it comes to April, they're going to have an additional tax bill that they need to provide for, as well as the salary that they were then paid back over that period of time. So something for them to budget for, especially as we get into the holiday season as well, as people are, spending in this time.
Yeah, absolutely. Simon or Jim, have you heard much about this from your end? I know this is largely a tax question, but
no, I think re-echo that last point that Gavin made. It's the possible double whammy on the tax impact. If you're being reimbursed for salary where you were while you were collecting CERB, and you get hit twice, and that's that's something that you don't want that shock, especially this time of year.
Yeah, for sure. Especially in the crazy year that 2020 has been for so many people, right? And kind of building off of that, there's at the beginning, kind of this talk of we'll work from home. Maybe we'll be home for 3 weeks. Maybe we'll be back to the office by Easter. Maybe we'll be back by September. Obviously, we're all still working from home, as you can see, or most of us anyway. And there's been a lot of questions now from some of our companies around how do we respect our staff's need for safety and ensure they feel safe if they're returning to work. So I guess this is kind of a multi-part question, but what are employers' health and safety requirements that they need to be aware of when their employees are all working from home?
Sorry, Kara, was that when employees are working from home?
When they're working from home, yeah.
Yeah. So I think, yeah, as you said, it is a bit of a multi-part question, but what you've got to return to, I think, and it's very important, during, or a good thought to have throughout your thoughts around COVID-19 is your policies so much are not going to change is that they're going to be regularly enforced or reviewed. So your liabilities and your requirements are still to provide safe workplaces. And, going in with, whether it's OHSA requirements or the general duty under the Workplace Safety Act to keep a safe work compliance still remains. Where the trickery comes is how do I apply that safe workplace to a workplace that I'm not monitoring? And I think as it goes back to the question of a duty to accommodate and whether or not that workplace is safe. So you're kind of balancing the black letter of the law with taking a proactive approach to listening to employees' needs, listening to what they're telling you, why don't they feel unsafe, and how can you fix it? I think the burden here on employers is to get feedback or to keep an open ear up to employees and make those changes or those accommodations as necessary. And again, this is a thread that you're going to see sewn through the entire process, whether you're dealing with accommodations, dismissals, or any slight change in employment. Again, I'm sure we'll get into it later, but the restrictions change obviously if employees are coming in from work. And I don't think this should usurp the employee's duty of their own responsibilities in keeping a safe workplace, because you're not going to be able to consistently monitor your employees, particularly with the assumption that employees are probably going to be leaving their houses quite more often and traveling a lot more than they would from the workplace. You don't know where they're going to get into contact. But yeah, I think that would be the thread, is to just ensure that your already existing policies are up to snuff and that you're trying to keep them in as enforceable as possible, with the slight caveat that you're going to have a bit of a greater open ear and listening to the feedback and adjusting as necessary.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, yeah, like you said, it's kind of this thread of that's going to weave through these remaining questions as well. Because we have some folks who are saying, no, I love working from home and I don't want to go back to the office. Mm-hmm. And so I know we've got some folks who are like, no, my team just really functions better when we're all in one place. And, and there's some industries that have been designated essential that they can come back. So what are your rights as an employer if you want to make your employees come back to the office? What if your employees don't want to come back because they don't feel safe, or they just don't want to?
Right. So I think there's kind of let's call it a two-leveled system here, where you've got the scenario you described where somebody really wants their employees to come back into work, and they're saying, our team, we need them to be in the office. Well, there is, as we were mentioning before, the duty of the employer to accommodate that request and see if they can make the employment work. But practically speaking, if the employee is unable to perform their obligations and their requirements and competencies under the contract from home, then you're running into a situation where that person might be primed for, a without cause dismissal. And I think from a practical standpoint, when an employee is faced with that decision, whether it's a dismissal or they're going to have to come back to the office, then, usually you're going to see employees come back into the office. Now, whether or not they trigger a claim for, an accommodation request is yet to be seen, or in that particular instance. But then again, you're going to be looking at everything on a case-by-case basis. And I think we've seen employers, look at these decisions and have come to a certain decision that, this is just not working. It's causing way too much hardship on our firm. We're not getting our work done. You're not communicating properly. This accommodation cannot be extended to you any further. And then at that point, you're okay to dismiss somebody, because at that point it is causing too much hardship on the employer. Again, I don't want to give any specific advice because everything needs to be taken on a case-by-case basis. And it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. It's really an individualistic approach, looking at all the factors, and even more so, I think it's a balanced approach as well. So what, you got to look at the cost of what would the cost of the accommodations be versus what would the cost of termination be, and just really balance those two options when making a decision whether to accommodate a request like that, or if you think you might part ways.
Right, and I think what Simon said there about balance is, is really important. There are workers out there who, may say, well, I'm just not being effective at home, and would like to just go back to the office. And if the all this, when we've talked about communication between, the employer around policies and things, like you've got to sort of understand on both sides. I mean, what's the employer doing for things like, administrative accommodations? Have they changed the workplace so that you can maintain physical distancing? Have they changed even sometimes work structures around when certain functions can be in the office and others? And again, back to like my first comments about the things that are under public health restrictions, whether you can actually come back or not, right? The employers are kind of working on, particularly those that don't have to be like in a manufacturing facility, that are more white collar, that are able to work in different locations, that you have some of those different considerations too.
Yeah.
The other thing to add there too, which I glossed over but should have expanded on, was outside of the duty to accommodate, and you're going to see this more in laborers' jobs or in, as Jim mentioned, manufacturing jobs, where you've got real, let's call them health place safety concerns that are, it's a difference between I don't feel like coming in, I don't think I'm safe coming in, versus this workplace is not a safe workplace. And, when a complaint like that is made, it can also go into, the occupational health and safety stream, whereby, a complaint is registered, an inspector is brought in, and you're dealing with the Ministry of Labor to determine whether or not the workplace is safe. So it's those in the white collar job is not going to come up as much because they're not really necessarily as used to dealing with those complaints. But there is a separation between I don't feel like this is I don't feel safe versus a declaration that this is not safe. And then there is an entire flow process for dealing with those type Ministry of Labor complaints, we'll call them. And often the result of those will be in order to get back to work or to make the appropriate changes. But I feel though 95% of the cases that people will run into are going to be that more accommodation complaint that Jim has enlightened on.
Yeah, makes sense. Makes sense. So on the flip side, we have folks who are saying, I'm going crazy at home. I've got a toddler. I have 5 people in my house. Like, I really, really want to go in, and my boss, my managing partner, my director, they're not letting me go in. What do you do then as an employer?
Well, I think it's still the extension of the same. It's what are the controls that are in place at the office, and are they sufficient to keep that employee plus all of the other employees that may be taking the same thing, to keep them safe in the workplace. And so there's a lot of what's expected here. So there's a lot of communication and coordination that's more in the spotlight now than ever before, because again, the rules of this sometimes are changing by the day. And so what the particular employer's plans are, what their contingencies are, and to the best ability, if they're able to have a safe and productive return to the workplace for that employee and for all the other employees, then, what we're seeing is most employers are trying to be as flexible as they can be, in thinking in this very short term, right? The long-term considerations are different, but we can maybe talk about those later.
Okay, thanks. That's helpful. Switching gears a little bit, at the beginning of the pandemic, all of my friends who work at Shopify got $1,000 to spend on creating a home office. And some people in the nonprofit field may have gotten less than that, just saying. So employers are saying, should we provide an allowance? Like, what's an appropriate allowance? And maybe they didn't give an allowance at the start, but now that it's become clear people, are needing to be home longer, what's appropriate to provide in terms of like office supplies, monitors, that kind of thing? Should they give money? Should they, give materials? What's your suggestion?
I can speak to it from a tax perspective. I don't know if you guys want to touch on it from a, employer relation or employee relation perspective, but historically, the government has allowed an employer to provide computer equipment or personal computer equipment alone to staff that are working. And the limit on that was $500. And the CRA was recently asked, are you looking to increase that limit at all? And they said, no, we're not looking at it right now. This was in mid-October, but they said we are going to continue to monitor it, and depending on how the pandemic is, we may make changes to that. So right now the limit is $500 that you can provide in terms of personal equipment, computer equipment, and then that employee will not be taxed on it. But the employee, if they go out and buy the equipment, they need to supply you with the receipts so that when you reimburse them, it's not taxable to them. So it's per employee, it's not per piece of equipment, just to be aware. And they've expanded that. It was just personal equipment, but it's expanded now to desks, chairs, so on and so forth. So if the employee already had, your computer that you provided to them, but they needed a monitor and a new chair, then that can be covered now versus just the equipment. So that's something to be aware of, and it won't be taxable to the employee. So that's something that is good, that can definitely be taken on by the employer. The other thing that we get a lot of is because people are working from home. There's are the people allowed to deduct a portion of their home expenses as well? So we've been seeing a lot of that. And generally, if you're required to work from home, your employer provides you with a form called a T2200. Now the CRA is in the midst of revising that and looking at all of this, and we hope to get some more guidance on it in the next month or two, obviously before people have to file their personal taxes. What the requirement is under that to work from home is that you have to work from home primarily. And that means, more than 50% of your time. And you have to do it to, on a regular and continuous basis to meet your clients and your customers. So that was what it was before in terms of a restriction. The CRA, as I mentioned, is looking at that in this new environment to say, okay, so many people have had to work from home. Does that criteria still work in this current era that we're in, or in the COVID era, as I call it? And you do need a contract generally. So, when you sign a new employee, you obviously have an employment contract, and within that, it's you're going to work from home. If we require you to come to the office, you'll do so in certain days. Now, people's contracts don't say that, right? Because the people that were working in the office are at home. So what they've allowed for is what is called a verbal contract, saying if you've made that agreement with that person, then they'll allow for it under a verbal contract. And then if let's say they change the criteria and you get all these qualifications, well, then the question becomes, well, what can I deduct and what should I deduct? And the answer depends on if you rent your home or if you own your home. And most people, I would say, we'll talk about people owning their home at this point, but obviously lots of people in the city rent as well. And if you're an employee of a company that owns their home, things like your property insurance, your property taxes, heating, utilities, so on and so forth, and some maintenance costs can be deducted. But the amount that can be deducted is only the amount relating to the space in which you work. So if you had a dedicated study and that's where you did your work from, and that study represented 100 square feet of 1,000 square feet home, then only 10% of those costs would be deductible. and you have to make sure that you itemize it and then prorate it and then deduct it. And if you were renting, then you deduct your rent cost, but it would be for that portion of the home. Again, similar to how much you're using that space. And then, if there's two of you working from home, well, that's where it gets a bit fuzzy. If one person's working in the study and the other person's working in the bedroom and you both are allowed to claim it, well, the bedroom is not really primarily all the time used. It's, you sleep in the bedroom, presumably. If it's a spare bedroom, maybe that's fine. But then it gets, you get into all these permutation and combinations that hopefully we'll get some guidance on in the next few months. But the key to remember is that you do need to get that form and to keep it. And we have tried to get the CRA to simplify the process, simply because if you think of some companies don't have that many employees, but some companies could have 50, 60 employees. And to get something like that for every single employee is, it's just adding more burden to the employer when they're trying to actually survive in this pandemic, and really should be focusing on the business versus on doing the compliance things. So, we tried to recommend, well, you're issuing them a T4 anyway. Can we just have it marked on the T4 that they're eligible to claim home office expenses? And the CRA actually came back and said no, and we're just waiting to see what the new guidance will be when they ultimately do come out with that. So
interesting. It's going to be busy time for a lot of accountants, I think, come next spring, with just the confusion over this.
Yeah. So the other thing I'll note is that, you can always, and we did this, is when people wanted to work from home, they have a monitor, they might have dual monitors, some of them have a monitor at home, and they wanted to work from home. We let them come in and sign out that monitor on a specific date and time and say, take it home and use it, but you've signed, that you'll bring it back, so on and so forth, so that is still the employer's property and they're required to return it. That doesn't provide any taxable benefit or anything to the employee. So if you have that equipment that's otherwise probably sitting in your office not being used, and you're comfortable with it, obviously, and I'm sure Simon can advise you to the legal aspect, you want to make sure you can also then provide that to them, and then they can return it whenever we all come back to the office at some point.
And Kara, one of the things that when the first sort of incentives or reimbursement sort of came in earlier on, is it was very reactionary to what I think was perceived as something that was likely short term, and that you'd get $100 or you get $500 to buy a chair or buy whatever. But I think you mentioned Shopify. They've made a very long-term decision on a business model in reaction to what they've done. And so you may see, to Gavin's point, people that are now working remotely being literally outfitted with company equipment that's not theirs, right? So that they're working on their home office essentially off of the employer's hardware.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
The other thing too to consider, and again, I hate to sound like a broken record, but if we link back to what we're talking about, accommodating employees' requests, this is a great example of a positive step that employer can take to fulfill that obligation. If someone's saying that they don't have the ability to work from home because they don't have the proper equipment, well, there you go. Like I know as a lawyer, I always use a double monitor. So that's something that I would need at home. And I just wouldn't be able to work without it. So if my employer, hands me that second monitor, my request is accommodated, suddenly I'm better able to work from home. So that I think it just furthers in that you'll kind of see this whole process of accommodation brewing as the conversation gets further along.
And beyond like the deductions that Gavin was talking about, and I know that those are kind of still being figured out, are there government programs, are there supports for employers? I'm thinking of the small businesses, particularly on this call. Are there resources or programs or grants to help employers adjust to this new remote workplace at this point?
So
go ahead, Gavin. Yeah.
So there's no grant per se that I'm aware of, but there are the subsidy programs, certainly the wage subsidy. So if the employers, obviously they need the revenue still to survive, so they have to make that decision. But if they're getting that wage cost subsidized, then that's in effect, a grant that they could then turn around and redeploy to provide the employees with some equipment. Presumably that cost wouldn't be as significant as the subsidy, so they'd be net ahead. But there's also the emergency loan program called the SEBA, and there's two tranches to that. So there was the first tranche that was announced that was $40,000 that you would have access to if you have a business account and payroll expenses and so on. And then there's the second amount stream where you have non-deferrable expenses, but you had to have filed tax returns and other criteria and so on and so forth. So you can have access to $40,000, of which $10,000 would be forgivable if you paid it back by 2022. So it's one of those where, there is that assistance. And so that's up to 40 grand that you can get backed by the EDC. And then they recently announced that there's another 20 grand that's available. And of that 20 grand, 10 grand of it, so half of it is forgivable if you repay the amounts by December 2022. And you can make your application by the end of this year. So they've extended the application deadline as well. So if employers are now considering, we're in the second wave, we were talking about people coming back to work, but maybe this is going to be longer. Should they be looking at that and making that application to get that additional funding, and they can provide those types of equipment to their employees in that regard, or purchase it for the company, knowing that when they come back, they'll have that back, right? So.
And just to echo the sentiment with SEBA, the emergency business account, is that while there are spending restrictions on what it can be used for, in terms of flexibility of programs that the government has provided, SEBA for a small business that qualifies is probably the most flexible program, because while it is a loan, as Gavin alluded to, over the course of it, $20,000 is forgivable if you take both tranches, only $10,000 in the first tranche, but the restrictions on what it can be spent on are minimal compared to the other subsidies or grants that have been provided. So it does give, a business a pretty large cushion to do with the funds as they see fit within certain limits.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I should, you always have to make sure we're speaking in generalities here in terms of what's available. So you always have to make sure that you're meeting the criteria of not only like the full eligibility, but if you meet the criteria and you have non-deferrable expenses, you can spend the SEBA loan and trace it to your non-deferrable expenses, and then your existing cash that you have can then be used to essentially buy equipment as well. So there's things to do, and obviously documentation and tracing will be key, but it's always prudent to then talk to your advisor when you're trying to implement some of these things, or look to how to best to just help your employees.
Yeah, great point. And good to know that, in different programs, there's more or less flexibility in terms of expenses. That's really helpful for businesses to be aware of. Want to switch gears a little bit and talk about I think kind of a little bit of a grim topic, which is constructive dismissal, because it's a term that people have heard kind of floating around the last couple months. Maybe they didn't really have to worry about it before. What do employers need to know about constructive dismissal? What do they need to avoid and be prepared for?
So I think it might be helpful to the viewers to kind of discuss from a base level what constructive dismissal is. And the easiest way to sum it up is a change in your workplace or in your employment relationship that is effectively renders your employment not null and void, but you're no longer able to complete your employment. So that's where the term constructive dismissal comes from, because it's essentially a dismissal, or there's been such a change in your employment that it amounts to a dismissal. It can take form in a number of ways, a significant change of salary, a significant change in hours, a significant change in work conditions. So the entire point of it is to prevent employers from changing, instead of firing somebody or terminating somebody, from changing the work conditions so substantially that it amounts to a dismissal. And then linking it back to COVID, I think where you're going to see it the most is change in hours. So if you're a hourly worker, you're used to getting 20 hours a week, and then an employer says, well, no, we're going to reduce your hours to 5 hours per week only, that could be considered a constructive dismissal. Or similarly, a reduction in salary, or maybe even less so, but still possible, such a change in the workplace conditions that effectively you're unable to perform your job. So the way that these are handled is an employee would terminate their contract, and then they would employment contract, just to be more specific. And then they would make a claim for constructive dismissal saying, hey, I was, I had to terminate because I was effectively dismissed. And the employer would then have to defend that claim or settle the claim out of court. There are two things that I would like to note, and we kind of touched on them a bit before, but that's, the reduction in salary, whether it's from a change of location or a change of hours or something similar. Previous to COVID, there was somewhat of an agreement on the courts that the range in which you can reduce a salary unilaterally was 10 to 15%. Now that's, again, everything is on a case-by-case basis, but that's the safe kind of neighborhood. Now with COVID, there was the emergency legislation that I briefly spoke about, where for the period of the emergency order, a reduction in salary of up to 25%, I believe, will not be considered a constructive dismissal, and effectively claims for constructive dismissal have been paused. Now, that being said, the best option here is to have a bilateral change in employment. So if you think that you're going to change your employees' wages, or you think that you've got to reduce your hours, what you'd want to do is you want to converse and communicate with that employee and look to get it on consent and bilaterally, because that's going to prevent you from any constructive dismissal claim. And again, if we speak from a practical perspective, a lot of employees would prefer to reduce their hours temporarily than they would to lose their jobs entirely. Now, it is, and then if you do decide that you have to go through the unilateral route, then we do advise people to do it across the board, across the same position. You don't want to start singling out employees and just reducing specific employees' salaries, because that will really give rise to a constructive dismissal claim. So I think that would probably sum up the period where you're going to see it the most, is reduction in wages and hours, to keep it to 10, 15%. And if you absolutely need to go over, to attempt to do it bilaterally. And then finally, if you absolutely must, you can hide behind that new emergency legislation protective that I think was enacted sometime in May 29th, if I'm not mistaken, and is continuing out until today.
Yeah, that's super helpful. I know, Jim, I'll let you add on to that as well. But I know, we've had some specific questions, like I had to give everybody, a little bit more than 25%. For a while, I had to give everybody 30%. If they take me to court, are they going to win? And of course, the answer is it depends, of course. But,
yeah.
But
Right.
I think, following, kind of what Simon is saying, like, as long as you didn't do it to only, certain employees or a certain band, if you're really trying to show you're being as fair as possible, right, then you're in a much, much better position.
Right. And to the really important point that Simon made, the best way to go here is to have a bilateral discussion and an agreement. And where I've seen like those large sort of cross the board reductions of, anywhere from, 20% to 50% of salary for periods of time, right? It's done in many cases on a voluntary basis. You don't have to do it. They ask that you do, and they generally like appeal to, this is, saving the more that we can contribute to this voluntary program, the less we can take broad permanent job action. And so, we've seen some of that. The other piece sort of generally where you're looking at, back to, we started at the start of, if you don't have to work in downtown Ottawa anymore and you can work out somewhere, where your cost of living is less, I did have very early on a number of employers saying, well, I can adjust down this salary on that basis. And where my conversations with them, whereas you really have to balance sort of, well, has the value of the work actually changed? Is it actually worth putting people in a position where they might actually either challenge you for constructive dismissal or leave the organization, right? Plus, it's hard to look at this salary by itself, because there are other things that potentially as a company and you're saving, right? If you're saving, like you're saving real estate things, you have to look at that well, what's the balance trade-off here? And ideally, if you make that balanced case and you can do it bilaterally, that's the best way to go.
Yeah. And the other thing too that I'd add is that, there's a caveat that we're speaking about non-unionized employees, because unionized employees will have large collective bargaining agreements, and often will have temporary layoffs or furloughs built in place in those collective bargaining agreements and the contracts. And the private employer generally will not have a temporary layoff scheme in their contract, and they're generally not allowed to either. So I think that's something that we just should note, is that this discussion is about a non-unionized employee from the legal perspective, at least.
Yeah, no, that's a good point.
I think that, Jim, with the clients that I've spoken to as well, it is looking at it in totality, right? It's also managing, like as you mentioned, lease costs, where you're in a lease agreement right now, and the rent programs that came in initially weren't actually that favorable to landlords. But now the new rent program that has come in recently is more favorable, and the tenant applies for it, and it's on the same basis as the wage subsidy. So they've tried to simplify things. So, looking at it from that perspective, now if you can get that rent subsidy, is it really worth the aggravation of that one or two individual salary, depending on how many individuals you have or you're looking at? And I think we can all agree here, right? The reason we're talking about employees in this is because they're critical to the business, like to help the owner survive, in the sense, and the business survive. So the talent pool keeps getting smaller and smaller, and especially in Ottawa, when you're looking at the tech side of things or whatever, the fight for talent is real, and in all aspects, right? So it's also managing that aspect to say, okay, how do I keep these employees happy? Because if I don't, yes, right now no one's looking to change jobs, but I think there was a recent survey done that said, 60 to 65% of people, when we do come out of this, who knows when that is, but would be looking to move from their current employer because they were dissatisfied with what the employer had done or how they've done it, right? So you don't want to lose that base of people, because as we all know, to get new people, to retrain them in your organization is going to cost you way more in the long term than that 15-20% reduction. But again, you have to make decisions today, because there's that, if I don't do that today, am I going to have a business to even worry about that employee? So the employers are in a tough spot at the moment, and a lot of decisions need to be made and balanced out.
That's a great point. I think there's so much competition. I mean, it's hard to remember, but if you even go back to February, people are saying, there's a shortage of some, types of talent, especially in Ottawa, and people are competing, paying higher and higher salaries, better benefits. But it's true that, like you're saying, employers are not just kind of this additional extra cost, that we have to outlay. They're actually what's keeping the business running, which is so important to remember, especially when it comes to times where people might be struggling. So when it comes to employee mental health, employee well-being, I don't want to even say productivity, but just making sure that your employees are doing okay. What are things you should consider as an employer? What are some things you could be offering, doing to help with that?
Sorry. Yeah, I can take this one on. I mean, I think in terms of, it's actually links into something that I was thinking about just previously, is that, COVID has kind of thrust upon us, or I should say has been a catalyst for change and accelerated change in the workplace, and, in many, many other fields as well. And, just thinking back to Jim and Gavin's comments, is that you got to look at everything through the whole. But it's also providing people with, an opportunity to reflect back on their business and see, what are our key channels, what are things that, we're absolutely need to keep. And I think that extends to employee retention, and looking at what are we making to keep people here, and what are we making to ensure that our employees are working as best as possible. So when something like work from home may have never been considered previously, now it's been thrust on employers, and employers are suddenly saying like, oh, you know what? Or some employers, I should say, are looking at work from home and saying that this is something that we'd really like to keep on. So I don't really think that anything has changed to the sense of what should you be doing to employers that you haven't been doing before, rather that COVID has thrust that thought upon you, and now you're forced to look at it because we are in such a state of flux. So I think just maybe making an audit of, or taking into account or an audit of what you provide to your employers, you know, if you haven't done so in a very long time, is probably now a good time to do it. As for specific recommendations, I think it's going to change. Like, you know, our entire discussion today, it depends from an employer to employer basis. But I think with the sensitivities around accommodations and the increased communication between employers and employees that has occurred due to COVID-19, now is a great opportunity to kind of assess and audit, you know, your employee retention, your employee policies, benefits, and everything like that, to be honest.
Yeah, one of the things, go ahead, Joe.
Go ahead. No, go ahead. Oh.
So one of the things that, you know, that you raised, Kara, is like, what additional things are you looking at or people are doing? And I know a few of our clients, as well as us and ourselves, we looked at it again in totality, and it's going to be different for each business and each employer. But we said, look, we generally have, you know, offices in other regions. We would travel to Kingston and Brockville and things like that to help out. So in that sense, we've saved costs from people traveling. We've saved costs from people training, you know, in-person training, those costs of hotels, those kinds of things that we would normally spend. So those are things we would give the employee in terms of training that we'd want them to continue their professional development. So now they're doing it virtually, but we've saved that additional cost. So how do we redeploy those funds to make sure that the employee is getting still the best that they can, and other clients are doing it? So we know that people have had challenges with working from home, if they've got kids that are homeschooling, so on and so forth, and the pressures on them are increased as they try to adapt to the new normal. So, you know, for instance, we've increased our benefit to say, okay, if you need additional support, either counseling support or otherwise, to get new strategies, well, we've increased the amount that's available to the employees for that, to kind of provide a targeted response to what their needs might be right now. And I think employers should do that on a holistic basis to see what is it that would best serve my employees, and how can I show them that, yes, my business is struggling, we're doing everything we can, but if they're rowing in the same direction by us giving them support, then we can all get through this together.
There's in this sort of remote work from home kind of new environment too, it is, you know, it's tough to sometimes for an employee to feel connected to the workplace. You know, I've had some, I was with a client the other day, and I was sort of at the same kind of call with the management group. And one guy said he hadn't been outside in like 5 days. You know, and you know, so there's this piece about really, as an employer, staying connected to your people. There's probably more reach outs you need to do now than you ever had to before. Checking in to see that, you know, are you okay? Are you getting what it is you need? Are you talking to, you know, teammates? Are you like, you're kind of trying to more extend this culture, but there's so much more sort of one-on-one requirement now than we've had, and that's that way to maintain that employer's culture too, just through just more reach out and more connection.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, and that's a really good point, and kind of leads me into my next question, which is, you know, if you're, you know, working from home, you know, in terms of your you know, the way that you feel productive might be very different, right? You might have been a really collaborative person in the office. You might have very little interaction with other people or your boss, right? If your boss is supervising a number of people. So how do you lay out those expectations for, I don't want to say monitoring, because I don't want that to be I don't want the implication to be surveillance, but how do you, you know, communicate to employees how productivity is tracked, you know, how to check in, how to, you know, to be present, how to feel connected, because I know that's something a lot of people are struggling with.
Well, a lot of just to start this one, a lot of so the first piece, so around sort of performance expectations. Mm-hmm. A lot of what we see is really, you know, the first reactionary piece of this was you as an employer, you're still expecting employees to be able to do what it was they were doing, right? So in terms of productivity and things, so that was sort of, I was going to say, an expectation and what performance is based on. As we've left, all of us on the panel hate this answer, but it depends. You know, that like what are you, how are you actually measuring productivity to begin with? Sort of what does that mean in the context? I think there's a lot of, in how work gets done, there's a lot more, you know, flexibility that employees are asking for because they have different pressures than they've had before. And I'm seeing employers do a lot more in terms of, you know, of flexibility around everything from sick time to personal time to manage things, where you might not be able to give your dedicated 8 hours in a given day. I think flexibility is sort of the theme of that. And a lot of people too, back to the point on communication, people put a lot on themselves. They think, you know, that, you know, I'm at home, I can do more, you know, so I can start work at 7 and finish work at 6. And we're seeing more and more now that we get further into this of employers like structuring the expectations of a day, right? We're not expecting you to be online at 7 in the morning or 10 at night, right? So they kind of are having to let like a lot of driven employees kind of, you know, they're kind of letting them off, like take that pressure off of them to decide and really dictate sort of what's that expectation.
Yeah. And one thing that I'd like to mention, and, you know, I'm going to just take off the legal hat for a second and just talk from a practical standpoint from what I've seen, is that I think a lot of, and Jim can definitely correct me if I'm wrong, but I think a lot of determinants of what is, if someone is being productive or not, is actually coming from the person making that determination and whether or not they're productive at home. So we've seen a lot of managers who may not be the most productive workers at home, and then to them that means that everyone is not productive at home, when often there's a lot of people that are very, very productive at home. So a lot of that kind of whether or not it's working, I think comes through the lens of the person that's making the decision. So if someone at home is making a ton of work, you know, it's going great, they're going to think work from home is going well, not regardless of what their employees are doing, but, you know, they might not pay as much attention. And then on the converse, that manager that is just having a really tough time from working from home is going to be much more reticent to allow their employees to continue to do so. And I don't know if that's, you know, I'd like to say anecdotally that's what we've seen, but it's also, there's a pattern that we've been picking up on.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, it's kind of like, but goes back to the same thing as if you're writing a performance review, you remember what everybody did last week, you know, as opposed to in January. And in the same way, like if what's close to you is a bunch of people who are absolutely killing it working from home, you're going to think it's great. If there's a bunch of folks in your team who are really struggling and aren't as productive, then that's what you're going to think is the norm as well. I guess that's normal, but unfortunately, you know, holds people to kind of different standards, which isn't great.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah. Another question, and we're going to open up for questions in a little bit. So folks who are on the call, please feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A. So some companies are laying people off, and they're having to do so remotely, kind of like that movie Up in the Air, if anyone ever saw that with George Clooney, where he like flies around firing people. And then there are some people who are hiring like crazy. Like we've got companies in Invest Ottawa who at the beginning of the pandemic, especially folks in like the cybersecurity, anything like work from home, cloud related, were calling us and saying, we're actually hiring for like 7 positions, but we feel really bad posting right now. Well, because we see so many people laying people off. So from what you all have seen over the last few months, what are some best practices for both hiring and onboarding remotely and terminating remotely and having folks exit your company?
In terms of hiring remotely, and you know, So the expectation now is pretty much everything is generally done by video call or phone call. Video by far preferred, but there are often more steps now. There's more, like we see sort of more conversations with that are one-on-one. There's also more, I find, from employers. There is, an awareness that this process of going through kind of remote job interviews and things for a candidate might be new, and the odds that, and we've said this, I'm sure all of us as hiring individuals in the past, said, well, that person may just have had a bad day when we interviewed them. Like there are often, now I say there's more steps, but there are more return calls, right? Just to make sure you stay engaged, that you're making a good judgment as much as you can, and trying to make the candidate as comfortable in that recruitment process, and yourself as a hiring manager comfortable in that process. That's from a hiring point of view.
Yeah, and I think on the termination side, the legislation hasn't changed significantly, except for a bit of case law that I can mention a bit, but you do want it to be done over Zoom, and you just want to be certain that, as you would offline, or as you would non-COVID times, that you're ensuring that you're following the Employment Standards Act and the employment contract itself. I think that the law hasn't substantially changed, except for a couple of emergency orders, and then one case which I'll get to a bit later. But in terms of the actual process of termination, you're just going to ensure that you're following your employment contract, you're following the ESA, and you're still going to be doing things in writing. And a letter attached to an email is better practice than doing something in a letter. And then, best practice would be to put it in an email and then follow up with a regular mail. Sorry, a PDF attached to an email and then followed up with regular mail. And again, to echo Jim's sentiment, video is always better than telephone. Yeah.
Yeah, no, great points, great points. Yeah, it's interesting. There's some people who, they really don't like to be on video. And I know this has been a real challenge for them, but when you're having these difficult conversations, it's just so much better than doing it via phone, no matter how painful it might be.
Yeah.
Right. And the point there, Kara, when you're in difficult conversations and you're doing it, when you're looking at video versus phone, from the person who's receiving that conversation, if you as a manager are delivering this, they're able to see your body language, your expression, understand that, like, look, this is not easy for anybody. But it gives them more context than just if it's black and white, right? Or if it's just the voice on the phone, right? There is a bit more personal connection there. So to the extent that that those conversations can be done on video, I think it's best for both parties, really.
And Jim, how important is, a good termination meeting to preventing any future claim and, kind of not sullying the relationship, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the last thing that you want is for someone to, slam down the receiver or turn off the video, and the next call's to their lawyer.
Yeah.
Because they're just say, well, I'm just, I don't want to be treated that way. I don't think it's so. Yeah, the more that you can, there's compassion in that process. There is sensibility in that process, and the more that you can do that, then you are as providing as good of an experience as is possible under the circumstances.
So this might be a controversial question, but if you're terminating somebody via video, should you record it or should you not? Is it more likely to help you or more likely to potentially hurt you? I know it depends, but yeah.
I mean, I would only record something with somebody's consent. I know, for people that bring lawyers in, there are people that will bring their lawyer in to terminate people. Lawyers can't record conversations. So I think it should just be done with somebody's consent. as tempting as it is, or perhaps an announcement right at the beginning. Now, I don't know from a standpoint of, okay, we're going to do this. By the way, I'm recording this. That doesn't quite set the correct tone. But the realities from a legal position, whether or not somebody was terminated properly or improperly, doesn't so much center around the conducting of the interview, rather that the correct notice or the correct pain of notice was given. And that's really where the discussion's going to come down to. So, I mean, I think that's more of a, an etiquette, and my personal view would be to stay away from it.
So would it make sense, just curious, obviously the manager would be present in doing it. Do you pull in somebody, in a small business, maybe you don't have this option, but if you have the ability, you pull in someone else to have a second person in there, Jim, or like, what do you think? Is it better to have two people so you're not kind of, it becomes a she said, he said kind of thing afterwards?
Yeah, often it is best to have two people, whether it's, the direct supervisor and whoever is your HR leader. In some cases, in private business, the owner is the HR leader. But two people generally is what I would say is best practice for both for that, he said, she said kind of thing, but just for another person listening in on the conversation.
Okay, good to know. Good to know. Going back to, and Gavin, you covered this a little bit in your first question, but there's a lot of questions from our companies around what extra stuff, forms, information they need to prepare and equip their employees with come, tax time. Do they need to be, talking to the CRA? Do they need to be preparing, what is it, the T2200 form? What additional things do they need to make their employees aware of? Because I think a lot of employers are coming into tax time kind of in the back of their mind hearing, I might be able to deduct some additional things, I might not, but they're not really fully preparing themselves for all the information they need to go forward with that.
Mm-hmm. So you're right, I did touch on it earlier, and there's not too much right now, but at the same time, the form that I mentioned, the T2200, is currently being updated. So you will need to provide that to your employee. And to the extent you just want to be, more prepared, I would say, updating your contract to say, okay, we're going to require you to work from home from this point to this point, or, until we change, the terms. That doesn't hurt in terms of having that documentation. From an employee perspective, they can prepare themselves just by making sure if they're going to try and get these costs deducted. First, we have to wait to see whether or not the CRA is going to allow the legislation of flexibility there in this COVID era to do that, and make sure that they've got how much is the space that I'm using. Make sure you're tracking all your bills and so on and so forth. And employers can, if they're requesting people to work from home, they may be allowed to pay a reasonable allowance as well to the people for working from home. And I'll just give an example. And again, it's fact specific, but let's say you had a certain level of internet and now your kids are home and so on and so forth, and you needed to increase your bandwidth. Well, that incremental cost could be something that the employer reimburses you without having it be a taxable benefit. So it's just another thing to consider as well. But in terms of documentation or preparedness for the upcoming season, right now, it's the make sure that once the new 2200 comes out, you have that for your employees. If you have paid them CERB or SUS, there's going to be more T4 reporting requirements on the employer. So be aware of that coming up and be prepared for that. And then, and then just making sure that your contracts are all up to date. So.
Yeah, no, super helpful. A lot of information to come, I'm sure.
Yeah. I guess I had a thought that, something that Simon mentioned earlier, and I think a few of my clients are doing this, where, they've seen their revenues decline and they're saying, okay, like this is an opportunity to take stock of kind of where's the business at, what's it doing, and how do I make it better, and how do I, improve? And some of that is just process redesign or looking at things differently to re-engineer the business. And some things they probably knew they had to do, and they just didn't get around to it because business was going and going and they didn't have the time. And now they have the time to pay attention to that. But let's say you then revamp a process, which then makes people redundant, and those people that you basically needed to service the volume or so on and so forth, you've now modified. Like, so I guess, guys, have you seen where people are doing that, and now they're saying, you know what, instead of it actually where I'm having a hard time finding people, instead of operating with 7, I can operate with 5 now because I've changed it, and I really don't need these 2, and they're kind of the people that weren't my best performers anyway, right? Like,
I mean, we've seen it particularly, maybe more by happenstance than by purpose, where at the beginning of COVID, people were looking at revenues and then fired a lot of people, or, they might have fired a big portion of the workforce. And then 4, 5, 6 months down the road, they're saying, wait a second, we're operating at the same efficiency or better efficiency than we were with all these staff members. So now they're not necessarily hiring back the people that they had fired, or they're not recruiting people to replace those early terminations. I think that's where I've seen it the most. But there are some groups that they are looking back at their businesses, and they're finding that they can increase efficiency by getting rid of people, or even paring down their businesses altogether and focusing on specific streams. I mean, we've seen that where investments into certain areas have probably not been the wisest investments, so they've cut them out completely and focused on their core competencies.
Mm-hmm. Well, I've started to get a lot more questions, Gavin, about sort of the long term, and that people sort of saying, we've learned something over the last 9 months. Yeah. Some things we like, some things we don't, some things we keep because they give us an advantage. And yes, some of them may have impacts on fewer people because I can be more efficient, or maybe not fewer people, but different skill sets as they, as they change. The other piece too, and I had a conversation with a client the other day, and it really is with this theme. There is an opportunity here for a lot of organizations to look ahead and really look at this. What have we learned? What lessons going forward? And more are doing this. This one in particular said to me, I'm going to wait until things get a bit more back to normal before I look ahead, and I'm pretty sure over the last 9 months we've sort of fundamentally changed culturally and in a workforce point of view, that the normal of December, January of last year, this year, we're probably not going back to. So I think there really is that opportunity to look at what can be different going forward, but that gives us an advantage to grow and make our business thrive.
Yeah, well put. One of the things that we had talked about with some of our companies in our accelerator before this panel was about employee right to privacy. So I know I personally hear a lot of, can they read my Teams messages? Are people, because I think that, people are using their, like you had mentioned, Jen, there are some folks who are working from like 7 a.m. to 10 p.m. They're on their work computers all the time. There's much, normally if you're home, you're working from home, you might throw a load of laundry in, you might check your bank account balance, you might pay your Rogers bill or what have you on your work computer. And I know at the beginning of our time working from home, Invest Ottawa had said, use your Teams to call your families. Don't pay for a paid Zoom account. You can use this for your own purposes. They explicitly had said that. So when you're working from home and you're doing a lot of life on your work computer and your employer issued equipment, what's your expectation of privacy?
Yeah, so I guess the key thing here to point out, I'm going to preface this is subject to change pending new legislation that has come in, but privacies have a reasonable expectation of privacy, and it can only be intruded upon if there's a sufficient business reason or a legal reason to do so. So if your employer, your employer can't be snooping on you, they can't be reading your messages, like your privacy rights that you would normally have as an individual extend to the workplace. Except for as I said before, like where there's some legal requirement to disclose because of FOIA request, or if there's some, like some reaching of evidence or statutory right to disclose. Otherwise, they have to respect your privacy. If you're worried about being monitored, I would raise it. And more importantly, is employees really have to be clear about the ways that they may be intruding or may be monitoring activities. All those activities have to be disclosed. So if an employer is monitoring you and they haven't disclosed that they are, that's a breach of your privacy. So it's not that they can't, it's just that they got to disclose it, and you have to accept it. Yeah.
Okay, good to know. Jim, I don't know if you had anything you wanted to add to that.
No, I think Simon covered it all.
Okay, great. So again, if you have any questions for us, please put them in. We have one here that's about sick leave for COVID or mental health support. So what suggestions, what would you say to employers who are considering changing their sick leave policy for folks who think they might have COVID or have COVID, right? So maybe they've used some of their sick leave days already. How would you suggest they maybe modify their sick leave to accommodate that? Or alternatively, folks who are like really trying to hoard back their sick leave and not come to work sick, but work when they're sick because they're worried they're going to get COVID. It's kind of a two-part question.
Yeah, well, I'll start. I think and I mentioned this earlier, I think flexibility has been sort of the key theme of what we're seeing, right? There are some pretty good sort of understandable pressures today, given the COVID situation that we're in, that employers there are different ways of taking time away from the workplace. It doesn't necessarily have to be a revamp of sick time, right? It can be just a grant of personal of paid personal time. There are sort of other mixes, and I'm seeing a lot of it. Some that are some that are actually extending an extra 5 days. Some that are putting in something that are if you have tested positive for COVID-19 and are self-isolating, right, there are provisions for that. So I think, again, it's a case-by-case basis, but you don't necessarily have to look at that employee time away as classified officially as sick time, or for someone to use vacation. There are some other things that you can do and think about.
Yeah, and I would just echo that sentiment that you want to be working with people, and also, as Jim pointed out, there's just because somebody is away for because they might be ill doesn't mean that you need to include it as a personal day or sick time off. And it's just about being flexible. In terms of people hoarding their days, it's going to reflect back to what your company policies are, and how well known those company policies were at the time of employment. And again, on the understanding between employer and employee of the necessity to either use those sick days or those vacation days, or if they roll over, and what the employer's policies are for unused vacation days. I don't necessarily think that the lack of ability to take those days will necessarily cause any issue. And I think what the best thing to do would just be to stick to the course of what was agreed upon at the time the employment relationship was created, and to stick to the stick to the employment policies of the employer.
Okay, great, thanks. Another question here about there's some social stigma. Essentially, when anybody is sick, takes a sick day, everyone thinks they have COVID at the office, which is, I guess, understandable. So the question is, as an employer, say, assuming you're not going into the office, assuming, I'm assuming this question is about, folks who are working from home, but just taking sick days, as an employer, obviously, what do you say, to your employees who maybe they were getting tested for COVID, but they feel uncomfortable telling people, or they do have COVID, but they don't want to tell people and alarm them? Has this come up for you all?
Jim?
It hasn't come to me directly from a client. There are, there are public health provisions here that that are specific to COVID, that would be relative back to contact tracing. In which case there are reach outs there. So but outside of that, sort of what an individual wishes to disclose, unless say it's bound sort of under that regulation, that's up to that individual.
Yeah, and I think the other thing there too is that, if the employer should be, if they are coming into the office, they should be following the contact tracing provisions. And I'm sure we've all seen, those 6, 7, 8 questions that you answer when you go into any type of employer. It should be noted that, even around those, there's particular privacy considerations, such as what questions you can ask of somebody. So I think, threading the needle here is looking towards, the necessity to disclose certain symptoms or issues in keeping a safe work environment versus respecting the employer's right to privacy in disclosing those issues. So if somebody is at home, I don't think there's really any necessity to force them to disclose whether or not, they're showing symptoms or they've come into contact with COVID. But when you're looking at protecting your other employees, and this goes back to keeping a safe work environment, you do need to ensure that employees are disclosing whether or not they've come into contact with people or if they're showing symptoms of the virus. So I think you want to take a two-pronged approach as to whether or not the person is working at home and they're safely distanced from your other employees, or whether they're coming to the office. And then if they're coming to the office, they're just going to fall into the same safety procedures that you've put into place and that you're just going to be carrying on normally.
So I know that, most employers are not the NFL, unfortunately, so they're not able to do, we see, I don't know, we've all seen those videos, right, of the NFL players, NHL players getting rapid tested as they walk into, they're standing in like the body scanner to see what their temperature is and everything. Once we get to that point, and I think we will get to that point where we can have these rapid tests available, can employers, when we're back in the office, ask employees to take those every day once? Is that something that violates a right to privacy by requiring someone to do it on site with the employer?
Yeah, so there's, again, particular privacy concerns with forcing people to disclose their information. It's basically when it becomes overburdensome. So from what we've seen most people doing, it's just as soon as they come into the office, and then if they leave the office to go for lunch and then come back in, that's when they're going to make those disclosures. It's not, and then this again is going back to the constructive dismissal issue, is that if you're constantly dropping by everybody's office to see how they're doing, they're not going to be able to continue to take their job. But where it's done for the sake of protecting the entirety of the workplace, it doesn't come to that point where it's a substantial change in the nature of their employment or a substantial change in the consideration of their employment. Where it does get a little bit more difficult if someone, you're towing the line of being overburdensome, and now someone's saying, hey, look, like this is getting ridiculous, I'd just rather work from home. And then again, you're reverting back to our conversation of, well, what accommodations do I have to make? Is this a refusal to work? Now they're not refusing because of the safety issue. Now they're refusing because I'm a really annoying manager. So again, you're going back to looking at things on a case-by-case basis, weighing the different columns of employment law and trying to fit in that particular fact pattern into the columns that you have in front of you. The biggest concern, though, just to reiterate about those disclosure forms, is the right to privacy and is the questions that you can ask. The best practice is just to keep them to the guided symptoms there. And I'm certain that there is actually a form either on the Ottawa Public Health website or Ontario Public Health website if you need to know what those questions are. Yeah, and I guess also one other thing just to relate back to this is it also relates to the employer's general privacy policy. Most employers will furnish a privacy policy at the point of employment. And, some of them will have instances where they're able to, collect more information. And if that's in line with your policy, then you should, you're on better footing than if it was not in line. But yeah, I think that's a point worth raising, is that some employers might find that what they're doing already falls in line with what they had been doing, or it's just a smaller extension thereof.
Yeah. Gavin, I don't know if you had anything else you wanted to share.
No, it's just, I guess I just wanted to just ask Simon, so we talked about, if someone, let's say the office is allowed to open because they're in an area that is not widely affected anymore. Like they've had, low incidence of cases, and they say, okay, I want my people all back at work because of the productivity. And then you talked about, I just want them back in because I feel that they're more productive. And yes, it's with their lens, but if they refuse to come in, then you still have to go through that duty to accommodate. Is that right? And why is it that you can't come in? What do you need to do at home? And maybe it's childcare or whatever that they can't, they can't send their kid to school. But you can't just outright say, no, you're done, right? I want you in or you're done.
Yeah, that's 100% correct. You've got to still go through that duty to accommodate. And that's really where the crux of the issue is at what point are the accommodations causing my company or my business undue hardship? And of course, that's going to be very different depending on the size of the firm. If what you need to accommodate someone is, just give them a new monitor and maybe a comfier chair, for a company of 100 employees, that's quite, a simple expense. But for, a startup that has 1 or 2 employees, that's a significant expense. So that's when we're going back to, well, it depends. It really, you got to really look at the duty to accommodate as on a case-by-case basis. Who's the employer? Who's the employee? What are the accommodations that are being requested? And do those accommodations go to the legal test of it's causing undue hardship? Yeah. But
one of the other things that was discussed, was talking about sick leave, Kara, that you mentioned as well.
Yeah.
And so just so people are aware, there's also, the government introduced another program called the Canada Recovery Sickness Benefit.
right.
So if you are sick and diagnosed, and you can get that benefit for a period of 2 weeks. And then there's also the Canada Recovery Caregivers benefit. So if your child needs to self-isolate and they're under 12 or their school is closed, then you can also get a subsidy for that, because they understand that, if you're, for example, an hourly employer, you may not be able to go in and do your job because you have to be home for that purpose too. So it may not impact your sick days or whatever, but there is another avenue that people can consider themselves personally to get some funding and some subsidy.
No, that's really good to know. I was at the at a blood lab the other day, and they said that they had to close down a couple of days, completely, because a lot of the employees' kids were testing, or not testing positive, but they were had a runny nose or had a headache or had something. And it's in those services, like the Dynacares or whatever, there's usually only 2-3 people working in there. So if you have 2 people who are home with sick kids, the whole thing has to close down. And so it's been a really big backup apparently for folks in Ottawa. And I was wondering, what can they do if they don't have sick leave even? So this is really, really helpful to know. We're coming up on, oh, go ahead, sorry.
No, the other thing I just wanted to mention is that, when the government came out with these additional programs, and they said about the rent subsidy. So they also brought in a top up of 25%. So if you are required to close because of a provincial ministerial lockdown, you get an additional 25% subsidy based on your, your revenue criteria and things like that. So it's just something to be aware of. Right now, we're lucky that in Ottawa, we're going, back into yellow from orange and so on and so forth. But certainly other areas, Peel and so on and so forth are in a lockdown mode, certainly for something. So they would get access, and who knows if our cases will spike again, but if they do, then at least there's some access for employers there as well. So.
And I think, Gavin, that rent subsidy, the new one, if you get that additional, brings you up to 90% coverage. So it's quite extensive, right? Yeah.
So it is. So if you hit that 70%, and again, it's the same thresholds for the wage subsidy that it is for the rent subsidy. So if you hit that 70% revenue decline, you're basically getting a 90% subsidy on your wages and rent. So yeah.
That's great. That's great. Well, I'm so impressed, Simon, Jim, Gavin, how much we've covered in the last hour and a half. So I want to thank you for your time, and also ask, is there anything major that you feel like we've missed that you want to just share with people, or anything that you would just want to reiterate from this time for employers to know? I'm putting you on the spot here, but
the one thing that I would say is that, whether it's your accountant, your lawyer, or any other professional, the importance of advisors in this particular situation, because things are moving so fast, new programs are coming out, cases are being decided, that it is really important to get a secondary opinion, or at least to get some little type of contact to see what is out there, what has changed, what are your obligations and your responsibilities. Because I think with the way that things are moving, it's really easy to fall offside some of these things, and it's always better to ensure that you're going into something on side rather than on the wrong foot.
And Kara, I would say there is an opportunity, given the situation that we've been in, to take a longer future look at what are the lessons that we've learned in the last little while that are applicable to our business going forward, that we can have our business can grow and thrive. Where might we have to change and get help with some of those discussions, whether because they're complicated in dealing with people, but the right back to that, what does our business go forward need to look like, and then how does that impact our people? I think it's a great opportunity to put some of the learnings that we've experienced to use.
Great. Gavin, any last parting tax wisdom?
Well, I think to just say that the government has tried to help all manner of businesses, and the programs initially weren't perfect. They came out trying to help the people and the economy, and they've done a lot. So it's there. It's something that you guys should try and take advantage of to help your businesses, and I'm sure a lot of you have. And if you need to help access that, I think there are people out there that can help you access those programs and give you the guidance to do that, because it's only to help your business survive and to help you move forward post COVID, really. So
great. Well, thank you all for joining us. Thank you to all the attendees, and we will have a recording, like Leah said, for the next 48 hours for you to revisit. A lot of great wisdom here. But thanks everyone again. Have a great day.
Great.
Thank you. Bye-bye.